Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture. This lecture has been successively and unbrokenly going since 1966, when the Trust was formed in 1964 by Lord Mountbatten in honour of his great friend and colleague, so closely associated with the foundation of the Republic of India. And Mountbatten was determined when Jawaharlal Nehru died that he would put in place a trust that would remember and continue to remember the attributes which he associated and which we associate so closely with Jawaharlal Nehru. We have, as a trust, two duties to perform. One is to provide scholarships for the very best Indian scholars who wish to come to Cambridge to carry out research work for a 3-year PhD program. And secondly, to organize and set up a memorial lecture which will be given by a person of international status and standing, and to have reference to the Nehruvian legacy, the idea that Nehru had and the founding fathers of modern India about what modern India should be. And I'm sure you're going to find this evening a fascinating view of that. So at the end of the lecture, which will happen in about an hour's time, Neil MacGregor has very kindly said that he's happy to take questions from the floor. So please do that. Our timing is that I'm going to, as it were, pull the curtain down so that at about 7:45, so that those who are involved with the dinner afterwards can have a chance of getting up to the dining room. So that's the timing. Those are the administrative details. And so it's my very great pleasure to hand over to Professor Sunil Kilnani, the director of the King's India Institute, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. And again, on behalf of my fellow governors of the Nehru Trust, could I welcome you all to this, the Trust's 34th annual lecture. And we're privileged indeed to have as our speaker this evening one of the truly global figures in the sphere of culture, in its conservation, its interpretation, and its dissemination. That he also happens to have a long-standing interest in the culture and plurality of India is, I think, particularly why he's with us here tonight. Neil MacGregor is director of the British Museum, a position he took up 12 years ago in 2002. And before that, for 15 years, he was director of the National Gallery. Institutions that are, as their names suggest, national in their purpose. But during his time leading these institutions, and I think especially as director of the British Museum, he's made it his mission to reconnect these depositories of human creation more intensively than ever before to the many places from which their objects and masterpieces have provenance, and thus to create spaces for dialogue and debate about the meaning of these works. In this process, settled views about national stories and self-conceptions begin to unravel, and truer histories begin to get made. Neil has a superb eye for the minute details of an object or a painting or a text, homing in to let us see something we might glancingly pass over. And he has an unmatched ability to pull back from the close detail and boldly to recover through an object a much wider world, to see refracted through it an entire culture and system of belief. Those abilities are, of course, on full display in his groundbreaking retelling of the history of the world through 100 objects, which he did on BBC Radio and in his book. It was a deceptively simple idea which turned out to yield a profound reading of world history, not primarily through texts, which would necessarily privilege a Western version, but through material things. Some of the objects reveal exquisite craftsmanship, others reflect a crude and daily functionality. But when Neil holds either type up to the light, we gain a much richer sense of the plurality and diversity of the world's history and the density of its linkages. In this respect, I think he's one of the finest exponents of a perspective quite rare today, a commitment to universalism, but based neither on a bland humanism nor on a kind of triumphant Eurocentrism, but hard-won through attention to differences and diversities and common predicaments, if you like, an inductive rather than a deductive universalism. Still, cultural investigation and exploration, no matter how rigorously done, can easily provoke the parochial. Even the uncommonly sensitive scholar may find himself buffeted by controversies over values, traditions, and such like. And I think among the striking aspects of Neil's career is how thoughtfully and sure-footedly he's managed to negotiate this delicate terrain, even in an age of outrage. So it'll intrigue you and I think interest you to hear that his subject for tonight is an exploration of the effects of cultural and religious pressures in India, prompted most recently by the pulping of a book by a prominent scholar of India, Wendy Donegal, and about what this might mean for museums and their collections. And when I first heard of what Neil's subject would be, I think Nehru's famous image evoking the diversity of India's history came to mind, where Nehru writes, like some ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer had completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. Letting diversity flourish and resisting erasure, despite the strategic romance of Nehru's prose, these qualities were hardly intrinsic to India's modern historical traditions. They were fragile values to be sweated for and defended. They were values Nehru sought to enact in the state that he helped to build. And so today, as India's capacity for inclusion and tolerance comes under pressure again, it seems most fitting that a scholar so deeply and thoughtfully committed to plurality will deliver the lecture that bears Jawaharlal Nehru's name. Neil.
High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, Sunil, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here this evening and for doing me the honor to invite me to give this year's Nehru lecture. I was asked to address one strand of the inheritance of Pandit Nehru in modern India. And I've chosen to address the museum and the connections between the British Museum and other museums in Britain and museums in India. Like many people in Britain, and certainly many people of my generation, my first encounter with an Indian museum came long before I ever thought I would work in a museum and long before I ever went to India. It came, as for thousands of people of my generation, in the first chapter of Kim. That, you may remember, opens on the porch of the museum in Lahore. Kipling's father, of course, was the curator of that museum, and Kipling grew up with a great awareness of the Indian museum tradition already established at that point. And the dialogue that begins on that porch is, I think, very significant for the question I want to address this evening, of how in Britain's and in India's museums, questions of Indian religions, of the relationship between faith and state, between faith and institution, should be, may be, must be negotiated. The ragamuffin Kim, you may remember, is sitting on a camel, and he's talking to his chum, Abdullah. And he's talking about what's inside the building. And his friend, Abdullah, says that it's full of heathen Butts, because he, as a good Muslim, knows that there's Buddhist sculpture inside, and this is not really a very appropriate place to go. It's fascinating in terms of future debates about the religious content of a secular institution. You may remember that what happens then is that a lama arrives, goes in, and together they sit down with the curator of the museum and they look at some of the art. But before that, the question is who should go in? And the question is who is able to go in? And Kim points out it is written above the door, all may enter. And the question comes back, without payment? And Kim, the child, the poor child, says, I go in and out, and as you can see, I am no banker. The idea that these collections are there for everybody to use was already well established. And nobody in the museum world could embark on a lecture about India in 2014 without wanting to start with the oldest museum in India, indeed the oldest museum in Asia, founded 200 years ago, which has just celebrated its bicentenary and has been splendidly renovated. It was one of the great attempts to create an institution that would gather India, the whole of India, and where it would be possible for the visitor to experience not just the art, some of the architecture, and the cultures of India, but also, of course, in due course, the geology, the botany, the zoology. The whole of India was to be present. And it is the British Museum's oldest partner. The British Museum had been founded for 50 years at this point, and although the Louvre, in a rather upstart fashion, had crept in between the two of us, as we were at war with the French, there was no question of having a partnership with them. So our oldest partner in the world as a museum is the Indian Museum in Calcutta. It's a relationship that's remained extremely warm, extremely close, and one of the great honours recently paid to the British Museum by the Indian government was the invitation a few years ago by Jawaharlal Nehru, then Secretary Culture, to set up a training program for the future leaders of Indian museums. We've now been doing this for 3 years, and every year 20 curators, this is just a list showing you the different museums which they come, 20 curators from different kinds of museums across the whole of India come together. And in courses that last for 3 sessions of 2 weeks each, address the issues of a museum today, looking after its collections, finding its public, choosing what themes to address through exhibitions, and how to ensure that those themes are then communicated to the public. The program this year started in the National Museum, Delhi, at the top, where it's being taught at the moment. In May, the delegates will come for 2 weeks to the British Museum, and then in September for 2 weeks to the Salajung Museum in Hyderabad. It's a very good example, I think, a very pleasing example of how close the relationship is. It also demonstrates the commitment of the Indian government and the Ministry of Culture to the improvement, the renewal of its museums, and the hope that those museums will play a bigger part, not just in the civic life of India, but of course in presenting India to itself and to those who visit. The British Museum is also working with the Ministry of Culture at Sarnath, with the Archaeological Survey of India, as part of a project with the Getty Museum to rethink the connection between the great Buddhist sculptures in the Sarnath Museum and the site to which they are connected, and to enable pilgrims coming for religious purposes to the site to understand better the sculptures, and those who come principally for art historical reasons to understand better the religious function of the objects. And with the CSMVS Museum, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum in Mumbai, we have a very long and sustained partnership. And it's with this that I want to begin, because in the course of this partnership, where we exchange regularly staff, information, expertise, and exhibitions, it, I think, became clearer to me than ever before the way in which religion, life, politics, and thought are interconnected in India, with consequences and results different from those here in the UK. Last year, the British Museum sent to the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai the first ever Egyptian exhibition to be seen in India. The British Museum had taken this mummy, the mummy of the high priest Nesper-Enub from the temple at Karnak, and explored it in a totally new way, using CAT scans, so that although the mummy is still completely wrapped, it is possible to see exactly what is wrapped inside the mummy, what this priest took with him as he set off in the afterlife, what he would need to negotiate the hazards of an Egyptian afterlife, which, like the Egyptian everyday life of his time, was a highly bureaucratic existence. So wrapped in the mummy are the right questions to the answers the officials will ask you at the various stages as you progress in the afterlife. One of the really discouraging things about most afterlives on close examination is how closely they resemble the current ones. And the new evidence allowed a much deeper engagement with what this priest, we know a lot about him, of course, from the inscriptions on the coffin and at Karnak, how he saw his challenges. But of course, the medical advance allowed us to know a great deal more about him than anybody had ever known in the 3,000 years since he died. Quite a lot about his diet, the state of his bones, the state of his teeth, the usual things. The reception in Mumbai was enormously enthusiastic. Huge crowds came, and we worked closely with the colleagues in presenting the mummy and the material around it. What we found surprising, because we had prepared this first for a public hearing, was we prepared a film explaining what the duties of a priest were, and a great deal of time spent on the ritual washings, the offerings of oil and food in the temple, very alien to our public, of course, completely familiar, completely understood immediately by every visitor in Mumbai. And that was only the beginning. Throughout, it was clear that the reverence afforded to a body from the past, a person on a journey, was central to the way the museum presented the object. This was not a mummy in the sense that we regard our mummies in the British Museum. This was a guest in India. And when he left Mumbai to continue on his journey, there was a ceremony, I think one could almost say a puja, to wish him well on the next stage of his journey through the afterlife. It was a fascinating insight into the way in which the, to us, remote religious practices of ancient Egypt could immediately make sense and add a new dimension of vitality to the person of Nesper-Enub. But it wasn't all so serious. This museum has perhaps the best outreach programs, particularly for children and public, of any museum that I know. And we were particularly struck by the fact that Indian families could take a trip on the Nile, an enormous success. And we're going to copy this. So when you come back, and working with them, we invited one of their curators to come to the British Museum, and they explained to us, of course, that no proper museum should be without a statue of Ganesh in its front door. And so we invited the curator from Mumbai to present an exhibition based on this beautiful 13th, 14th century Orison sculpture of Ganesh. It's on at the moment, just by the front door of the British Museum. And here, the partnership became extremely valuable. We have always presented this object previously as a work of art, as a sculpture in a certain kind of tradition of sculpture with, of course, a religious meaning, but essentially as an object from the past. Our colleague Manisha Nine from Mumbai, who you see here, wanted to present it in a completely different way. What does Ganesh mean to an Indian today, particularly a Mumbaiker today? And also, of course, what does he mean to the hundreds of thousands of Indians living in London? It allowed us, for the first time, with our Indian collection, to invite an Indian curator to address the London Indian population as well as the rest of us. And Manisha was very keen to point out not just the artistic, historical, cultural traditions in which this statue sits, but the role of the festival in Indian life, in the street. And not just the role today, but the role that the festival played in British India as a focus of debate, of protest, where people could meet if they chose for political purposes in ways that were otherwise impossible. She situated Ganesh in the street, religion in the street in a way that for most of our visitors is unfamiliar, and she did it very powerfully. And then she, of course, wanted also to show that Ganesh exists in the home, indeed in every home, and created a home shrine, all of which you can see at the moment in the museum. It's proved extremely popular with visitors, both of British Indian visitors and British visitors, and is, I think, another demonstration of this different relationship of faith, life, politics, public, private, and the institutional. It was even clearer, perhaps, in the last major partnership exhibition we had with Mumbai, based on the Cyrus Cylinder, which ran, as you see, from December last year to last month. The Cyrus Cylinder is one of the most important antiquities of the British Museum. When the Persian king, Cyrus, building the great Iranian Persian Empire of antiquity, in 539 BC conquered Babylon, he made a declaration that the Persian Empire would not be like previous empires. The Persian Empire would not have slavery, but above all, unlike the Assyrians of Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrians we all know about from the biblical story, who had taken people captive and confiscated their temple goods and the images of their gods, the Persians would run their empire differently. They would allow all the deported peoples to go home, and they would allow all the different peoples of the empire to worship their own gods in their own language, in their own way. They were all to be allowed to recover their temple goods. For the Jews, that meant the ritual vessels taken by Nebuchadnezzar from Jerusalem. For others, it meant the images of gods. And in this new Persian Empire, Cyrus's view of what an empire should be, all would be free to worship as they chose. There would be no state religion. There would be many religions encouraged by the state, provided they all prayed for the king. It was, at the time, revolutionary. Until then, there had been state religions imposed and punished, and deviation punished. Here was a new model for holding a great many people together, people of different traditions, different languages. And the Persian Empire became, of course, one of the great models of a particular constitutional view throughout history. This was excavated in Babylon, where it was buried as a foundation document in the 1860s, and has been in the British Museum ever since. In 2010, at the request of our colleagues in Tehran, with whom we'd done a great deal of cooperation and exchange, it was sent to Iran. This is the Iranian press greeting its arrival. It was welcomed by President Ahmadinejad, and it was treated like a returning head of state. Here was the great Iranian emperor the founder of the great Iranian Empire, demonstrating in his declaration that Iran would defend the rights of all different religions, and it was taken to link to the contemporary Islamic Republic's insistence that in the Iranian parliament there should be a seat reserved for Christians, for Jews and Zoroastrians, even though it is an Islamic Republic. A very significant document of medieval politics from 539 BC to today, and its presence was recorded in the museum as though a plaque might be put up today to record the visit of a head of state. This seemed to us a very extraordinary phenomenon. It allowed a different kind of history of the relationship between religion and the state, a different kind of Iranian history, to be presented. And we were asked, after it came back from Tehran, if we would send it to the United States. And so it went to the United States. Here you see it on the ticker tape, on the screen in Times Square in New York. We believe it's the only cuneiform inscription ever to have been on the digital screen in Times Square. And in the US, it was received, of course, in a very different way. Here was a totally different view of Iran, a totally different idea about religion and politics, and, perhaps most interestingly of all, an unexpected, for most Americans, connection with the American Constitution. This is Jefferson's copy of Xenophon's Life of Cyrus, rather fanciful Life of Cyrus, but nonetheless an admiring Life of Cyrus. Jefferson, writing to his grandson, tells him if he wants to understand the ancient world, begin with Cyrus. Jefferson, who modeled the American Constitution's equal distance from all religions, all faiths, very much on the kind of idea that Cyrus had proclaimed, and causing for many in the United States a startling thought that maybe their constitution owed a great deal to Iran. It is the purpose, I think, of museums to do this kind of thing. It is precisely that which objects can do. They set up the connections, and they set them up in startling ways. And when the Cyrus Cylinder went to Mumbai, it took on a completely different resonance. Firstly, because, of course, Cyrus is seen by many as the first Zoroastrian ruler anywhere. And for the Parsi community in Mumbai, Cyrus is a great hero. Many indeed carry his name, Korosh. So there was a quite different religious resonance in Mumbai. But there was also, of course, that very fundamental question that the ideas put forward in the Cyrus Cylinder about a ruler at equal distance from all faiths are strikingly close to those of Ashoka. Is there a connection? And there was a vigorous debate at the conference we held in Mumbai with our colleagues from Tehran and India about whether it was possible that there was a connection between the two. Some feeling very strongly Ashoka's ideas were entirely Buddhist, in an entirely Buddhist tradition, and have nothing to do with what had happened a couple of hundred years earlier in Iran. Others suggesting there might have been a wide debate about how you manage communities, empires of different religions, different traditions. Whichever, both of them, Cyrus and Ashoka, came to similar conclusions, that the state should not have its own religion, but should take an equal distance from religion. It is, of course, the notion of a secular India that was of such significance for Gandhi and Nehru. It is, as Amartya Sen is fond of pointing out, a very particular and Indian notion of secularism. This is not the secularism of the French Revolution, which is anti-clerical, anti-religious, and sets up an antipathy and an antithesis between state and faith. This is the tradition of Ashoka, of Cyrus, of a monarch supporting all his subjects and tolerating whichever faith they wish to choose. It is an important concept because the relationship between faith and politics, faith and power, as you all know, became of life and death significance, tragically, in the life of Nehru's daughter. This is an extraordinary scroll we have in the British Museum of the life of Mrs. Gandhi, as you can see here, being born out of the map of India. Here in the second screen, as you can see, her birth at the top, then her reading to Mahatma Gandhi, and then bottom, her time at Oxford University. Presumably that's meant to be dark blue as a clue, but this is Mrs. Gandhi in Oxford. And then the tragic moment of her assassination, and then Mrs. Gandhi being raised into heaven by Lord Vishnu. It is a document that sits very properly in the British Museum, part of our desire to document the history of India from the earliest times to now. And it raises centrally that question of the relationship, the unavoidable relationship between faith and the state. And that, I think, was somewhere behind the foundation of the National Museum in Delhi. Founded after independence, and the foundation stone laid on the 12th of May 1955 by Pandit Nehru himself. This was to be different from the Indian Museum in Calcutta. It was to be a place showing the range of Indian cultural traditions, and I think its purpose can perhaps be resumed in one remarkable object that it holds. This is one object in a series of artifacts made in the context of darshan. The idea being about knowing the God, knowing yourself. And what it is meant to hold is in fact a mirror in which you can ultimately know yourself. It is, I think, the purpose of all public museums. It is to know our own selves through our past. It is to address the function of memory, collective memory, in the formation of identity. Ben Okri memorably described the British Museum as the memory of mankind, where the whole world can consider its identity. It is, I think, the purpose of all museums. And not accidentally, at the very door of the National Museum in Delhi, as you enter, and I've been unable to find out whether this was actually Pandit Nehru's decision or not, although I think it could well have been, is a copy of the rock inscriptions of Ashoka, setting out exactly the ideals that I mentioned, the duty of the ruler to the ruled, and in particular, that duty of respecting all faiths, that notion of a secular state in an Indian Amartya Sen sense. It's something that, of course, had been in India from the very beginning in the museum world. At exactly the time that the Indian Museum is being created in Kolkata, that wayward spirit, Hindu Stuart, was beginning to collect his museum of sculpture. Stuart, who became an Irishman, who became increasingly convinced that Hinduism was the highest form of religious thought and ethical experience, who said, whenever I look around me in the vast ocean of Hindu mythology, I discover piety and morality. And as far as I can rely on my own judgment, it appears the most complete and ample system of moral allegory the world has ever produced. He started collecting these objects to persuade his fellow British residents in Calcutta of the truth of that statement, that here was a higher religious and ethical system than the one they were familiar with. Unfortunately, as you know, as William Dalrymple has memorably written, he combined this with an attempt to persuade English women to stop wearing corsets on the basis that they often had metal in them and they were likely to be struck by lightning, and that the metal was actually more needed for the pressing requirements of Bengal than for their own vanity. It did perhaps undermine something of his seriousness of purpose. But the purpose was central, that if we want to understand how a religious system works, a close engagement with the works of art do very well. And many of the objects from his collection, including this wonderful Shiva and Parvati, are now in the museum. What Stuart, of course, could never have imagined was that this, which he collected in order to show to British people in Calcutta, would now be visited regularly by hundreds of thousands of Indian people living in London. And in front of this sculpture, we regularly find offerings of fruit, which is, I think he would have been delighted. It's an aspect of Indian life that, as you know, fascinated people from the very beginning. The fact that Indian rulers, from Ashoka on, engaged with the religious. The Mughal rulers seeking out religious leaders of different traditions. Roe, the first English ambassador, amazed that the emperor wanted to speak to him about religious issues until late at night, until he was so drunk he could speak no longer. And always this generosity in the Indian tradition to new forms of religion and a capacity to absorb them into what was there before. A kind of hospitality of theology, totally unknown in monotheistic Europe, where the sole possession of the only truth allowed you with confidence and some pleasure to punish those who were in error. Not so in India. The Buddha, as you all know, seen by many as the ninth incarnation of Vishnu, an idea bewildering to Europeans that the two traditions could even be thought of by some in this way. The Sikh tradition, again, the idea of Guru Nanak between his Hindu and his Muslim friends and advisors. These are all commented on by British visitors with admiration and amazement, that there is an acceptance of different ways of addressing and pursuing truth. And it can reach the most startling consequences. Here, well, if we had more time, I would ask you all to guess what the subject of this is. But you can, I think, see that there has been a birth and that the baby is being washed. What you're actually looking at is an 18th century Mughal miniature derived from Cornelius Court, the 16th century Flemish Dutch friend of Titian, birth of the Virgin Mary. And this is taken over by the Indian artist, but not for Indian Christians. This is the birth of Maryam in the Quran, as described in the Quran, for an Islamic public in 18th century Mughal India. This is a kind of coming and going, of exchange and generosity, which is, as I say, unthinkable to Europeans and greeted with enormous generosity, found with great admiration. And it's present in a wonderful Bengali scroll, another Bengali scroll in the British Museum, which my colleague Richard Blurton has published and written about, where you can see on the left-hand side a Hindu offering, on the right-hand side a Muslim one. Both in the same scroll, undivided Bengal, sharing a tolerant acceptance of these two traditions side by side. This scroll was the center of our attempt a few years ago to present one of the great moments of Bengali cultural, religious, public, private, theological, political, civic life, the Durga Puja. And we invited craftsmen from West Bengal to come to make an image of the Durga Puja, of the Durga, in the British Museum. They came, I'm going to run through very quickly, and did the whole thing from the very beginning, bringing the implements, the materials, the earth required, the earth from a prostitute's house, all these things that we were told were required, brought from Calcutta. And in the great court, slowly, the image took shape. And crowds began to gather, particularly London Bengalis and their friends, particularly grandparents who wanted to show their grandchildren what had gone on at home in Bengal and which they'd often never seen being made. You can see what fun this was, day by day, to watch this slowly take place. And you can also see the scale of it in the great court. And huge crowds came. And at this point, something very remarkable became clear. We had a visitor's book with suggestions, with comments. What was very clear was that the visitors were large numbers of them Bengali, as you can see from this, but they were both Hindu and Muslim Bengalis. This was a Bengali tradition which expressed a Bengali cultural identity, the kind of identity at the same time we had a small exhibition on Rabindranath Tagore, and Amartya Sen came to speak about the many identities that can be held, that must be held by any full person, and to speak against the reduction of people to single identities. The net result was spectacular. And now came the difficult question. Here is what is quite obviously a great cultural, civic, religious creation. But would it have been proper in a secular space to have the full puja? Or would that be an intrusion on those who did not regard this as primarily a religious experience? We decided that this was where the museum's role stopped. And so the puja was held elsewhere. But the whole of London had been able to join in to experience something of the richness of this tradition and what the story of Durga means to many different kinds of Indians, and what that celebration means across Bengal. One of the most pleasing episodes was the question of what should happen to these statues at the end. As you know, they are, by tradition, by convention, placed in the Ganges. But luckily, by one of those great metamorphoses of which all great world religions are masters, the Ganges can, for the moment, be any river that runs nearby. And so the Thames at Putney Bridge became momentarily the Ganges. And after prolonged discussions with the hygiene river operators, it was agreed that Durga could be returned to the waters of Ganges/Thames, and as she was returned to them, a rainbow appeared over the bridge. We felt this was the ideal signal of how important these ideas are. And it showed, of course, just how true and how enduring a truth this coexistence of traditions in a Bengali visual culture, a Bengali civic culture, are, in spite of the brutalities of partition. But we also wanted to make clear that there is an Islamic tradition. This is an Islamic scroll. This is of Gaji, of a Pir, a Muslim holy man in Bengal, performing the sort of miracles that holy men perform. And so we had a debate, as we often have after our exhibitions, on whether on where Bengali identity lay, given this duality of tradition. A debate chaired by John Snow, and as you can see on the right, led in many ways by Amartya Sen. And that led us to decide that, having presented the Hindu cultural tradition, we needed also to address the other. And so, in a wider context, very shortly after, we put on an exhibition of Hajj, which we wanted to present as the one part of the Islamic experience which non-Muslims may not share and may not watch. As non-Muslims may not go to Mecca or Medina, this central moment of a Muslim's life, which affirms the worldwide community of Islam, is one that cannot be shared or seen. So the exhibition looked at many traditions. We wanted to address, as you can see again from the audience, the fact that Hajj is now part of a British experience. This is something that happens in England, in Britain. Hundreds of thousands every year go on Hajj, and many British Indians who are Muslims make the pilgrimage. And we wanted to present it historically as an Indian tradition, this wonderful series of illuminated manuscripts of a Hajj from the late 17th century, beginning at the port of Surat, then sailing, this wonderful idea of sailing across the Indian Ocean to Oman, then to the port in Yemen, then to Jeddah, and then, of course, ultimately to the Kaaba in the center of Mecca itself. And we wanted to show how deep this was, not just as an ancient tradition, but of course one that was transformed by the steamships in the 19th century and became a critical administrative task, this religious function of 19th century India, with Nawab Sikandar, who played a huge part in rethinking the Hajj in the 19th century, and simple documents like the fact that Thomas Cook was appointed as a carrier for the Hajj from the government of India. These trying to make the point of how closely interconnected these traditions are. We, particularly now, having separated these strands, India living with a far closer and far more enlivening connection. What did people take with them? If they couldn't take money, they often took this kind of object to sell. What did they bring back? We know from the Red Fort that the rich brought back extraordinary souvenirs, including this symbolic footprint of the Prophet, an extraordinary object to which we shall return. And we wanted to look, of course, at how the phenomenon of Hajj, the Kaaba, this is a drawing made of a magnet in the shape of the Kaaba with iron filings around it, all drawn towards the Kaaba, demonstrating the centripetal unifying effect of the Hajj. This, if you like, is the easy bit of presenting religions in museums, both in India and here. But there is, of course, a very much more difficult bit. And it's a bit that's shown by another Bengali scroll. We have, thanks to Richard, a wonderful collection of ancient and contemporary Bengali scrolls showing the attack on the Twin Towers. And it is, of course, a demonstration of the fact that religion is a powerfully divisive, destructive force in our modern societies and raises very serious questions in terms of presenting in a museum the nature and the practice of religions in their impact on society. For the museum, the British Museum, it has raised quite serious issues. What levels of historic engagement with violence or suffering is it proper to show? Might that appear to justify contemporary views that suggest violence is part of proper religious behavior? Is that part of the story that we should properly present, or is it something that should be available for researchers but not made public? Can you inflame the situation, or can you explain it? It is one of the major problems, I think, confronting institutions today, aiming at presenting how societies function, which is what the British Museum was set up for, which is what all museums are set up to do. Who are we? How do we think about our inheritances of different sorts? It's a question that's become very acute in India in recent years. And you will all know the case of M.F. Hussain, the painter whose works were found to be offensive and which were the subject, these exhibitions in Britain and in India, subject of protest and indeed attack, and a real question of whether and how this kind of art should be shown. It became a major problem for M.F. Hussain in the year 2006, when criminal proceedings were begun against him because of his painting of the Bharat Mata, a representation of Mother India as a naked Hindu goddess with the names of major Hindu cities, particularly Hindu sites, but other sites, written over her body. I'm not going to show you it because it has caused such offense and such distress that in a museum you may choose not to look at it, in a lecture it's much harder. It is perfectly available on the internet to consult and to consider. But in 2006, criminal proceedings were brought against M.F. Hussain because of this image, because of the distress it caused. And in 2008, it reached the Supreme Court of India. And there the Chief Justice, K.G. Balakrishnan, refused to initiate criminal proceedings against Hussain for allegedly hurting public sentiments and the national pride of Indians. There are so many such subjects, so many such photographs and publications, he said. Does the sentiment of the petitioner get scandalized by the large number of photographs of erotic sculptures which are in circulation? Will you file cases against all of them? What about temple structures? Hussein's work is art. If you don't want to see it, don't see it. There are so many such art forms in temple structures. And the Chief Justice then dismissed the criminal proceedings. It was a very significant moment because it reaffirmed the constitutional, secular constitution of the country and the right to express religious ideas which might be offensive in public places and in public form. It is an issue that is still very present today. You will all know last month of the decision by Penguin after complaints about the content of this book, the decision of Penguin to withdraw it from circulation in India and indeed to pulp the contents. These are very serious questions in any society, in Britain as in India. How do we properly strike the balance between the sensitivities, the beliefs sincerely and deeply held by many, and the right of others to question, to challenge, to disagree, or indeed to mock, which is not, of course, the case here. There's no mockery involved here, I don't believe. In Britain, it was a battle fought out very publicly in the 18th century in the Enlightenment. And the British Museum was set up, among other things, to enable different views of religion to be presented in a public place. In a country that was, of course, in every sense Christian, with the head of state as the head of church, with an established church and a clear view of religious right and wrong, nonetheless, Parliament in the 1750s created the museum as a place where these debates should take place. A safe place for very dangerous discussions. A place where the freedom to put different views which might be unwelcome, but which should be respectfully put. That was very much the founding principle of the British Museum and all the other museums subsequently created in this country. It is, I think, something that is part of the consequence of a secular constitution in India, that this question needs to be addressed. I think there's no way of it not being addressed by the museums of India, particularly a museum like the National Museum, which has at its front door a replica of the Ashokan edicts. I have no idea how an Indian museum should tackle this, but it does seem to me that there is no question that this issue needs to be thought about and indeed cannot be avoided when the narrative of Indian culture, which is in such deep measure religious, is presented through the artifacts. And in a very fascinating way, the National Museum of India, under its new director, Dr. Venu, has, I think, done something quite remarkable and exemplary. And it's where I want to close. At the end of last year, in Brussels, as part of the Europalia exhibition, the distinguished Indian art historian and scholar, Naman Ahuja, presented the exhibition, The Body in Indian Art and Thought. It was a remarkable achievement, drawing on collections from the whole of India. He wanted to show to a European audience just how different the Indian notion of the body is from the European one. Very crudely, the Judeo-Christian notion of the body as sinful, fallen, corrupted, to be, if possible, abandoned, neglected, and certainly not talked about, if you can avoid it. A totally different Indian tradition of thinking of the role of the body and the connection of the body to the spirit. The exhibition is now in Delhi, and to show you, to give you an idea of just how remarkable it is and how challenging for a non-Indian, this great exploration of life. The first room is about the death of the body. Everything is inverted, and a very, very powerful introduction to death and the body in death and the body then in life. But fascinatingly, at various parts of the exhibition, Naman Ahuja has gathered all the different traditions of Indian religion in their address to the body and presented them side by side, quite deliberately inviting us to look at them as different ways of pursuing truth, presenting them respectfully without comment. I just want to take one element of that, which is the footprint. He runs a whole series of footprints, and beginning, as you see, with this 3rd century Buddha Pada, talking about this particular moment of Buddhist iconography before the image of the figure of the Buddha is shown, but some representations of aspects, emblems of his presence being shown. From the 3rd century, as you can see, these footprints, all the way through to the 11th century, where, from the Indian Museum of Calcutta, this enormous, twice or 3 times the size of a human foot, this Buddha Pada, the same tradition, a tradition that runs through the centuries. And then he moves on from the Buddha to the Vishnu Pada in the 18th century, pointing out that here it means something different. This is not the same thing. He links this tentatively to the narrative of Vishnu, who coveted the wife of Atri, and Atri condemns him or curses him to being worshipped only through his feet. And making the point that this is, of course, also a form of respect, have your feet respected, touched, a different reading of the same physical footprint, literally footprint, for a different spiritual purpose. And so on through Lakshmi, this oblation tablet, through this Jain votive tablet, and to the footprint of the prophet, or the spiritual footprint of the prophet, or the emblem of the spiritual footprint of the prophet. The language becomes extremely complex in all these issues, as you can understand, and treated with the ultimate delicacy. Here, I think, the National Museum is making a very powerful statement in this first exhibition of its new director. The first exhibition drawn from the whole of India since the founding exhibition, which led to the making of the museum in 1946-47. Just after independence, the big exhibition in London went back to Delhi and became the nucleus of the National Museum there. This is the first exhibition drawn from the whole country since then, and is, I think, an inspiring statement of how this institution can present the different religious traditions of India, to allow the spectator to conclude what they will, to debate as they choose, and to form their own view. It is, I believe, an address absolutely in tradition with the inscriptions outside. It's often said that the museum in India is essentially a colonial institution, which has little place in a country which is still so rich in its temples, and where the artisanal traditions that made the works of art still flourish so fully, that we need museums because our skills and our beliefs have changed. India needs them less because those are still alive. One of the questions being addressed by museums at the moment is what the role of a museum in India today should be. And I know that Naman Ahuja and Dr. Venu at the National Museum believe that one of those roles is precisely to be a space in which, as a secular institution and a secular space, they can address and present the different religious narratives of India. That in this museum, it will be possible for all to see India as it has been and as it is. Thank you very much.
I think on behalf of everybody, that was a tour de force dealing with the reality of the ambition and the foresight that Nehru had in creating a secular state, and the role in which the museum plays in presenting and curating that argument. I think a more powerful illustration of that you couldn't possibly find. Neil MacGregor has offered to take questions, and so I'm very happy to turn it to you and to see what you would like to ask him. Yes, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, in view of the politicization of museums internationally sometimes, and the focus on objects in foreign museums which have particularly iconic national representation. I'm thinking of the Elgin marbles. Is there anything special in the British Museum or the Library, British Library or Victoria Public Museum or elsewhere, which you would be afraid could be subject to similar pressure from India, aside from the
which is not in the British Museum, I would hope. I think the answer, the straightforward answer is no, I think not. But let me give you a wider answer. The purpose of any museum, like the British Museum, is to present the whole world for comparison. That's what the 18th century idea was. That if you looked at how different societies organized themselves, you would be less sure that your way of doing it was right. The point of these was to generate tolerance by forcing understanding that there are other ways of doing things. And that seems to me to be a very important area. The museum, of course, lends objects all around the world. And that seems to me absolutely critical, that objects should be shared with everyone in the world and lent. The museum is the most generous lender in the world. But I think the interesting thing was in the Indian context is because the Indian Museum is created in 1814 so early, the Indian museums are enormously, I mean, really, and everything that matters is effectively in India, either in the Archaeological Survey of India site museums or in the museums themselves. There are, of course, significant holdings in museums in Europe, but I think most of my museum colleagues in India, I mean, certainly there are no claims outstanding, but I think most colleagues in India would recognize that the narrative of Indian cultures can be very, very fully told in terms of the Indian museums, the richness of those holdings.
Yes.
Neil, thank you for that brilliant lecture. A suggestion. You mentioned when Cyrus Cylinder went to America, you had Thomas Jefferson's copy of Cyropedia Xenophont. Why don't you next year, in 2015, Magna Carta's 800th anniversary, have an exhibition with Cyrus Cylinder, Magna Carta, Ashoka's edicts, perhaps even the American Constitution?
Thank you. We have indeed been talking about this with the British Library, because what is so interesting about all those documents is that when you look at them, indeed, what they actually say is rather disappointing. What they have become is, of course, a screen onto which our ideals can be projected, and they give an authority and an ancestry for traditions that we believe to be valuable. And that, they all share that, exactly that. So we will certainly be comparing them. And indeed, we've already begun talking about how to make the connections between Cyrus Cylinder and Magna Carta and Ashoka, the edicts fit directly into that. No, thank you.
Very good question. Anybody else like to ask a question of Neil? Yes.
It would be wonderful if it did come to London. I have to say, it was put together quite rapidly, which is all the more remarkable. It was an astonishing, I hope some of you had the chance to see it. It was the most astonishing exhibition. It was put together quite rapidly as the opportunity in Brussels arose, and very sadly, because of the timetable on which museums operate, it wasn't possible even to consider it. I would love it to come to the British Museum and for it to be seen in London. It would be the most remarkable chance to look at the whole conspectus of Indian culture through the prism of the body. So if you know any of the people involved, it would be wonderful, because it did, I think, present in a way that was completely grasped. I don't know whether others agree. I think for those who are not Indian and not brought up close to Indian cultures, the narratives, particularly of Hinduism, are difficult to master and to understand, and the Buddhist ones as well. The immediacy of the objects gets you over that problem. You don't need to worry immediately about what actually is going on in this particular scene, what it might be saying, what it might be meaning. And that's why it was such a powerful exhibition. It did speak to the, if you like, to the illiterate about these central and powerful ideas. So I hope very much it will come.
further.
I just want to ask Neil, is there any sort of plan to send some of these artifacts, even in a sort of a smaller frame, into regional areas in UK, because the Indian diaspora and a lot of other communities are living together, and perhaps that would be quite helpful in understanding in our culture, in a multicultural type of
can I say, yes, had we had another 2 hours, there are still there are many slides coming, because what we've been doing in the British Museum is producing small exhibitions, smaller exhibitions that can travel around the UK. And at the moment, for instance, we have an exhibition of Sikh history, which is in Bradford, but it is moving around the UK. And this is particularly important. We have a partnership with Leicester Museum, which is, must be one of the largest Indian cities outside India now. And it's very important, of course, that those British citizens be able to pursue their own history through the museum. So we have a regular partnership with Leicester. We tour exhibitions like the Sikh turban with fighting with military emblems. And this has a very powerful effect in cities like Bradford. It means, of course, that the local Sikh community can be brought to the museum with a particular reason. Many of them have not frequently been before, as we discovered with our Bengal exhibition. A very large number of those visitors were first-time visitors. What was pleasing was we were then able to organize tours in Bengali of the Anglo-Saxon collections of the Parthenon sculptures, whatever. Because this is, of course, the point, that you look at Bengal's culture in the context of the world. The same happens with the touring exhibitions. And Glasgow is another city, of course, where we have very strong links of this sort. So there's a regular flow of exhibitions coming from the British Museum to address the different Indian diasporas in the different British cities. It's a central part of our role, I think. And just there's one of the other interesting things, particularly for more recent immigrants, and it became very clear also in the Bengali exhibition, is that the museum is a peculiarly safe place, is seen as a safe place, particularly for women to go. And for people who are nervous about that aspect of life in the UK, what can be offered and made available in a place like the British Museum is, I think, of great value. So we organise English as a second language courses through the collection, aimed very largely at the women folk who are less likely otherwise to be out and in contact. It's a very valuable role the civic space, the safe space of the museum can play.
Yes, one last question.
Actually, just continuing with that Bengali exhibition thing, I was intrigued by the decision of the British Museum to not have the puja.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, given that there was already many kind of borders being crossed, including, for instance, the immersion of the statues in the Thames.
Yes.
So what then would kind of make us understand the decision not to hold, for instance, puja?
It's the question is really what is the secular space of the museum that must be equally available to everybody, and where I think it has to be the immersion, of course, was not in the museum space clearly, but the thinking behind it is a fairly consistent one for all religious activities. That clearly we have Christian objects, Hindu, all kinds of objects, and clearly people will come to venerate them or use them privately. But I think it's very important that anybody be able to come into the museum and not feel inhibited by the fact that there is somebody else's religious service ceremony taking place in a space which belongs to them, and where they could be inhibited in using their museum And there's that opening chapter of Kim, again, this is open to all. This is the founding principle of the British Museum, that this is the museum for the citizens. It's not the ruler's museum. And that was our thinking. Now, you may feel that the line could have been drawn elsewhere. There's a constant, you can imagine how difficult these decisions are, but that was the decision we took, that it was possible, it was proper to show the making, the building, to have dance music in front of it, but that the specifically religious aspect should take place somewhere else. And that's what we try to apply that equally across the collection, because obviously we have similar kinds of exhibitions, events on many other religions.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. And thank you to Neil MacGregor for an absolutely outstanding lecture this evening, but also an outstanding addition to the outstanding collection of lectures that has taken place in the name of Jawaharlal Nehru and his memory since the foundation of this trust. And on behalf of the trustees and you all here this evening, can I thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful lecture, Neil. And the hope is that the text from it, and indeed maybe some of the images, will appear in due course online, where you can find all the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lectures. If you go to Cambridge Trusts and then go to our partners, and you will find the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Trust, and then you will find all the texts of our lectures since 1966, and they include some absolutely outstanding lecturers and texts, quite memorable in the context of that large period of time. But I don't think any in the context of culture, which Neil has spoken about, culture and politics, have we had anything quite so outstanding and to the mark as we've heard this evening. It's been an enormous privilege. Neil, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Now if I can ask those that are coming to our dinner to make their way back to the river room as soon as you can.